information that's coming in. With motor to this point, I've made it sound very simple. We have a corticospinal tract, and that's about it. But it's really not that simple. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about how not that simple it is. And that's why we see such different motor presentation. That's why it's really a big pet peeve of mine for a physical therapist to tell me someone has motor deficits. Because you can have all different types of motor deficits, and you're going to treat them differently, depending on whether it's spasticity, or it's flaccidity, or it's involuntary movement, or it's rigidity, or whatever it is. It's going to be something different. So just something to think about. If we didn't have a motor system, we would have actually no way of interacting with the external environment. So what does that remind you of? The video? The diving bell, remember? The diving bell butterfly? Yeah. My daughter actually came up to me the other day and she goes, I want to get this book. And it was The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. I was like, where did you hear of that? And she was amazed that I knew of it. But it was actually listed as one of the top 100 books for Books A Million. Interesting. But, so read it. I've never read it. I just watched the movie. But again, we're really only able to do two things with the environment. We can contract our muscles or we can secrete things. And that's about it. So just keep that in mind. And we're not talking about this motor system. We're talking about our motor system. Lots of objectives, so we'll get through that. So big thing that we're going to talk about is all the different regions. This is simplifying it. The cortical motor areas, the brainstem motor areas, and then how we activate the spinal cord to have our motor response. But when we think about movement, we have lots of different types of movement. Voluntary movement, voluntary fractionated movement, isolated movement of the fingers, the wrist, the elbow, whatever we're doing. That's one class. So that's complex, it's goal-directed, it's probably synergistic, functionally synergistic. It could be abnormally too, where I need when I go to reach for something, my hand's going to move first, and then my elbow's going to extend, and then eventually my shoulder's going to stay stable. So we have a lot of synergistic movement there too. Then we've got our rhythmic repetitive motions. So these are more things like walking, things like our equilibrium responses. They're more stereotyped, more automatic. They're not as complex. They're not typically learned. And then we've got our reflex responses, which are completely involuntary and very stereotypical. So when we look at the whole picture, we've got to think of movement as a sensory motor loop, both feed forward and feed back. So in that sense, we start with let's start here with the motor cortex sending out some signal to the spinal cord. Proprioceptors are going to detect what the length of my muscle is, how much tension on my tendon. What type of receptor is going to tell me how much tension's on my tendon? Golgi tendon organ, and that's going to tell me what? What's really a Golgi tendon organ telling you? Force production, how hard you're contracting. So we get all that proprioceptive information. Eventually, and we're skipping the cerebellum at this point, it's going to go to the thalamus, up to the sensory cortex to tell us what happened. Yes, you kicked the ball. No, you missed the target. Whatever happened. And then we're going to adjust our motor plan. So this is very simplified, but what we really have is we have feed forward and we have feedback. So we anticipate before we kick the ball what it's going to be like, right? Have you guys ever made a feed forward mistake where you anticipate a movement and it doesn't quite go right? Yes. Like stepping up or down a step that's not there? Have you ever done that? So you've anticipated this entire motor plan and all of a sudden you fall on your face because the sensory, it wasn't there was no step. Or there were two steps or whatever the problem was. So we also have that feed forward aspect. So again, we've got our upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. I'm not going to spend too much time on these. But the upper motor neurons, for the most part, are in the precentral gyrus. Their cell bodies. We're going to go down the corticospinal tracts to the lower motor neurons, which are going to be in the brainstem for our facial muscles, and then in the spinal cord for the rest of the body. So really, when we think about motor, and the motor systems really can be divided this way, we think about voluntary limb movement, or even reflexive limb movement, but independent limb movement, and then we think about our postural control. So our axial muscles, our neck and our trunk are actually regulated differently from our limbs. And we need these two systems to work separately, but also work together. So we call these two systems essentially our dorsolateral system, which is going to be our limb manipulation system, and then our ventromedial system, which is going to control our trunk and our axial musculature, our posture and balance. So our dorsolateral system is what we've been talking mostly about so far, which is our lateral corticospinal, is one of the big ones. We'll talk about a couple others. But again, we're just controlling our contralateral limbs. And then our ventromedial system, which we really have not gotten too far into, are going to be controlling our neck and head and our posture and balance. So in order to move my arms in control, what does my posture and balance need to do? Stabilize. If I cannot control my trunk and I can't maintain my proximal stability, I can't move my arms functionally. So you're going to see patients where you have them in supine where they don't have to maintain their trunk position, and they can do elbow flexion, they can do wrist extension, everything looks good. You sit them up and it all falls apart. So we need the two systems to work together. So I've kind of made it sound like upper motor neurons inhibit lower motor neurons, and they do. But most of them actually do this through an interneuron. They actually synapse at an inhibitory interneuron. So most of them do that. We do have some monosynaptic connections, and those are going to be the more precise connections. So these are going to be the ones to essentially the muscles of the hand. So our upper motor neurons do terminate somewhat differently. Remember that in serial processing, we've got the upper motor neuron going to the lower motor neuron, and then lower motor neurons. Remember, we really have two types. We've got our alpha motor neurons, which are going to the extrafusal muscle to cause that muscle to contract, and then we co-activate the gamma motor neuron. And what does the gamma motor neuron do? Contracts the poles of what? The intrafusal muscle. Why? What? So it doesn't squish. What happens if it squishes? You can't detect position sense or kinesthesia. So we have the gamma motor neuron basically setting it up so that we can constantly get that proprioceptive information. So this is just looking at it in the big picture. Again, we've got our GTOs, we've got our gamma motor neurons and alpha motor neurons, and sending out the information. Now, that's just the simple serial processing. We also have parallel processing, because every time I go to reach for an object with my dorsolateral system, might I want something to happen with my trunk? So I need that parallel processing between the dorsolateral system and the ventromedial system. So as I go to reach, my trunk is elongating on this side that I'm reaching on, and it's shortening on this side. And I need that to happen so I can get a more effective reach and I can maintain my balance. Okay, so we need them to work in parallel. So again, we've got both feed forward and feed back. And in this example, I've got the feed forward part, is that when I'm going to reach, my trunk actually fires before my arm. Because I know I'm about to reach for something. That's going to throw my center of mass perhaps even out of my base of support. So I've got to have those postural sets ready. And when you actually look at EMG activity, you see that trunk activation before the limbs move. So when that person's getting ready to hit that baseball, you see that trunk get ready so that they can handle the perturbation. When that ball hits the bat, they're not going to fall over. So we're going to go through the different regions. We'll start with the cortex. So in the cortex, so far we've really talked about the primary motor area, which is in the precentral gyrus. We also have a premotor area. We have a supplementary that's not on this slide that we'll look at. We've got a frontal eye field, and we've got Broca's area. These are all called motor areas. So we've got our frontal eye field. What do you guys think that does? What? Right, consciously moves the eye. So I can voluntarily look to the right, look to the left, look up, look down. That's my frontal eye fields. Broca's area, we know that's going to be a motor planning area for language, for speech and writing. And then this premotor area, which is here, it's just ventral to the primary motor area, is going to be, like Broca's area, it's going to be involved in strategizing or planning which upper motor neurons I've got to activate to execute whatever motor task I'm going to do. So the premotor area actually lights up when we're mentally rehearsing something. We'll actually see the supplementary motor area. Has anybody heard about that? That's kind of a hot topic sometimes. Supplementary motor area. There's been a lot of, I guess, news on mental rehearsal for athletics. So what have you guys heard about that? Anything? Does it work? Yep.
We used to do it before our championship meet. It was like our visualization or whatever. We had to visualize your race, swimming it perfectly, so that you would see better when you actually did it.
Okay. What'd you think of it?
I always got distracted. Didn't have
We have to get you, get your mantra.
A mile, so
It was like, that's 20 minutes of visualization, or 17 minutes. I don't know how fast you did it, but.
Isn't it like the Michael Jordan thing where he'd get the ball during a free throw and do like a visualize it going in and then he'd make it?
It could be, yeah. Basically, there's a lot of talk about it, and what they've done, what they've looked at with it, is that what they see is that you actually do get the supplementary motor. Here we've got all the different regions. We've got the supplementary motor and the premotor. These areas get activated. So you see those get activated with the visual rehearsal. And it's thought that it's known that essentially we've got our goal, which is you want to get the ball in the hoop. You want to swim perfectly with elbows up or whatever. And you've got that goal in mind. That's the supplementary area is doing that. Then it sends its message to the premotor cortex, which is what the strategy. Which upper motor neurons am I going to need to activate to do that? And then we've obviously got the workers, which is the precentral gyrus, the upper motor neurons. So what we see with mental rehearsals, we see the supplementary motor area and the premotor area being very, very active. Why don't we see the primary motor during mental rehearsal? Because you're not moving. Okay, exactly. But activating the supplementary motor and the premotor area sets you up to have a good motor plan when you do activate those upper motor neurons. So, and there is some work in rehab too, to have patients visualize sit to stand, visualize walking, all that, and with the idea of getting those motor plans improved. And then the cerebellum, which we'll get more into, is again not just executing the movement, but keeping it coordinated and also involved in motor learning. And then again on the cortex, we've got it represented depending on the level or the number of fibers that are innervated by each neuron. So that's cortical. Brainstem, our big motor centers in the brainstem, we've got our red nucleus, which is going to be the origin of our rubrospinal tract. We've got our tectum, which is in what part of the brainstem? Midbrain, and it's on the dorsal surface of the midbrain. And that's going to be the origin of our tectospinal tract. We've got our vestibular nuclei. Where are they? What? Floor of the fourth ventricle, basically at the junction between the pons and medulla. Mostly in the pons. They're going to be the origin of our vestibulospinal tract, and we'll get into these. And then the reticular nuclei, which are going to be the origin of our reticulospinal tract. We've already talked about the red nucleus. So what does the red nucleus, or the rubrospinal tract, do?
Flexion.
Flexion of the upper extremities predominantly. It's really a parallel of the corticospinal. So it's, do you think it's a dorsolateral tract or a ventromedial tract? It's limbs, dorsolateral. So it really follows a very similar path to the corticospinal. Tectospinal tract. So this is coming from the reticular formation to the lower motor neurons in the spinal cord. So what typically happens if we activate or maybe even inhibit them? What happens when you inhibit your reticular formation to your motor system? What? You fall over. Have you ever, I know you would never do that in this class, but when you're losing your arousal level, what happens? Right? So that's reticulospinal, going down. And then how are we going to activate your reticular spinal? I'm going to yell at you. I'm going to throw something at you. Somebody's going to kick you, right? And then what's going to happen? Or you fall. You hit your head on the table. Okay? And then what happens to your posture?
Straighten up.
All right, so is this a ventral medial tract or a dorsolateral tract? Ventral medial. It's a postural response. Did I say this was reticulospinal? Did I say tecto?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I jumped. I was reticular formation. Tectospinal, sorry. Tectospinal. Erase the video. The reticulospinal was reticular formation, obviously. You guys should have said that. Tectospinal is from the tectum. And the tectum, we haven't gotten into too much detail, but we have our superior colliculi and our inferior colliculi, which are part of our visual system and auditory system, respectively. And basically, what they do is they have a map of visual and auditory space. And so when we see something out of the corner of our eye, we get some visual cue, or we hear something like somebody walking in, okay, you're peacefully studying in a room, you think you're all alone, and all of a sudden you hear footsteps, what do? You turn toward it. You want to see what's there. That's our tectospinal. So it's basically in response to a visual or auditory cue, you have a postural response. And it's usually turning toward the stimulus. So that's tectospinal. And then vestibulospinal. What do you think that's going to do? What does our vestibular nuclei tell us is happening? We're tilted, or we're falling, or we're spinning. A posture and balance. So basically, if my vestibular nuclei are saying you are falling to the left, or to the right, really bad, left and right. Okay, what would my vestibulospinal tract do for me? Bring me back up. So those are my, basically in response to postural changes, I'm going to right myself, which means bring me back to vertical, or hopefully catch my balance. So I have some type of equilibrium response. So since I said it wrong, I'm going to say it again. So rubospinal, more flexion of the upper extremities, that's a dorsolateral tract. Tectospinal, stimulus is what? Visual or auditory stimulus, and we basically posturally turn toward that stimulus. Vestibulospinal, posture and balance, so I'm tilted or something, I'm going to respond to that. This is dorsal medial, and then reticulospinal is to arousal, either decreased or increased arousal. We're going to have a postural response. So those are our brainstem areas. At the spinal cord level, we've got dorsolateral and ventromedial lower motor neurons. So we've got dorsolateral ones are going to go to the limbs. Okay, and if you remember the kind of somatotopy of the ventral horns, we have the limbs being more lateral, and then the trunk and axial musculature actually being more medial. So this is the ventral median neuronal pool, again, just more medial. So just the two, at the spinal cord level, we're talking about the somatotopic organization of both the tracts and the lower motor neurons. So our dorsolateral system is our cortical bulbar tract, What are our corticobulbar tracts? What are they doing?
Cortex of the brainstem.
Cortex of the brainstem to do what? It's motor. We're in the motor system lecture. Muscles of the face. So this might be, give me one cranial nerve that'll affect the muscles of the face. Facial, that's a good one. That's a lot of the muscles of the face. Maybe another one. Trigeminal. That's for what? Chewing. That is for sensation, but we're in the motor lecture. So, so this is muscles of mastication. One more biggie. Actually, more biggies. 4 more biggies. You got the oculomotor ones, so 3, 4, and 6. Hypoglossal. Don't forget about the tongue. All right. Phew. All right, so those are our corticobulbar tracts, or the upper motor neurons going to whatever cranial nerve nucleus. Trigeminal for muscle mastication, facial for your eye and your mouth, hypoglossal for your tongue. Then our lateral corticospinal tract, which is going to go to our contralateral upper and lower extremities. And then our rubrospinal tract, which is going to really go from the red nucleus to the contralateral extremities, more flexion for the upper extremities. Then our ventromedial pathway. We've got our vestibulospinal, which we just talked about, going from the vestibular nuclei. All of these pathways, we're not going to go through the pathways like we did for the somatosensory. Realize, do you think you ever activate the right side of the trunk without the left? That's really hard to do, because if I am reaching, let's say, down on my right, I have a concentric contraction on my right, but I need to have an eccentric contraction on my left, or what will happen? I'm just going to fall right over. So with the ventromedial tracts, it's not like the dorsolateral where we really will have just right hand activity or just left hand activity. With the ventromedial, if you notice most of the pathways, and I'm not going to go through them, you're going to have some type of bilateral input, and you need that. You need, when I'm rotating my trunk, I need my left side to do one thing and my right side to simultaneously do the other. So with all the ventral medial pathways, you see more of a bilateral, not necessarily symmetrical, sometimes asymmetrical, where my right side is doing something different than my left, but a bilateral activation. So I'm not going to go through the pathways, but realize, because if you look at them, you'll see all this garbage happening at the bottom, and that's all that bilateral stuff, that it's got to activate both sides of the spinal cord. Okay, so vestibulospinal from the vestibular nuclei, reticulospinal from the reticular formation, tecto from the tectum in the midbrain, and then ventral corticospinal. I didn't talk about this one. Take a guess. It's in the ventral columns, goes from the cortex to the spinal cord. So if it's cortex, what does that mean? What? Voluntary. Can I voluntarily flex and extend and elongate? All of that. I can voluntarily activate my trunk. Am I precise like I am with my extremities? No, I'm not. But I certainly can rotate and elongate and all that voluntarily. And that's what my ventral corticospinal tract does. So I can have voluntary movement of my trunk. Vestibulospinal, is that voluntary? Reticulospinal?
No.
Tectospinal? Those are all subconscious pathways. But ventral corticospinal is voluntary. So here's our lateral corticospinal that we've done many times. Upper motor neuron, cell body up in the precentral gyrus, crosses at the pyramidal decussation, synapses in the ventral horn, and then lower motor neuron goes out. Rubrospinal, remember the red nucleus is at the level of the midbrain, and then it's going to cross just like the corticospinal tract, synapse just like the corticospinal tract, and go out. The vestibulospinal, we actually, remember, have a lot of vestibular nuclei. So we have several different tracks for this. We have 4 vestibular nuclei on either side. Big thing I want you to see is this part. Is that we see a lot of, again, bilateral activation. So you're not going to have a unilateral vestibulospinal response. Reticulospinal, same thing, the same loop-de-loop sort of commissural stuff happening at the spinal cord level. Tectospinal, what do you see? Same kind of thing. Spinal cord level, a lot of commissural activity. You need to have that. And then ventral corticospinal, this is going to go down the ventral columns. Again, it's going to be conscious. But again, look here. I can't really activate one side of my trunk and have a functional response without the other. You try to do a sit-up just on your right side. Give it a whirl. It's not going to work. Okay, try to rotate and just activate one side. It's not going to work. Okay, so you know, obviously with stroke, when you do have some of these muscles involved, you see abnormal responses. But if they're voluntarily, if they're working, you're going to have them both activated. So this is just looking. Here we've got our cerebral cortex. So these are where our origins of the corticospinal tracts are, the corticobulbar tracts are, and then we've got our brainstem originating areas. So our reticulospinal fibers. Here's our corticospinal fibers going all the way down, rubrospinal fibers from the brainstem. And essentially all of these pathways are going to eventually act on those extrafusal muscles and the intrafusal muscles. Be that whether they're conscious pathways like our corticospinal, corticobulbar, or those are it, or they're subconscious pathways. So just looking at comparing the two systems, function-wise, the dorsolaterals are going to be our skilled movement, our limb manipulation. Our ventromedial pathways are going to be our postural responses, our balance reactions. As far as the tracks go, for the most part, the dorsolateral system is all crossed, so it affects the contralateral limb. The ventromedials are going to be crossed and uncrossed. Bottom line is we have a lot of bilateral activation. Where are they projecting? Through the lateral spinal cord for the dorsolateral and through the ventromedial spinal cord, hence the term, for the ventromedial pathway. So these are that ventral column, which we really haven't talked about yet. As far as the motor neurons are activating, in the spinal cord is going to be our dorsolateral motor neurons, which are going to be our extremities for the dorsolateral pathway versus ventromedial neurons. And then as far as our responses, the muscles that are activated, for the most part, our dorsal lateral column is going to work more on our flexors. More of our voluntary movements are going to involve flexion. And then more of our postural and balance actions. So if you're trying to regain your balance, do you typically just flex over? No, it's much more extension of everything. So for the most part, when you see how many fibers or how many neurons are activating in the fibers, you're going to see a lot more dorsolateral activation of flexion and ventromedial of extension. Okay. So again, we've got the two types of movement that have to work together. So this is like the classic parallel processing. We've got to have your postural set and your voluntary movement always being activated together. So it's, again, a lot of the postural set is very subconscious, automatic maintaining position, whether you're reaching, whether someone's trying to push you over, whether you're catching a ball, versus the voluntary movement, which is typically going to be our dorsolateral system. So again, our postural set is going to be our ventral medial system, our tectospinal, vestibulospinal, reticulospinal, and ventral corticospinal. And then voluntary movement is going to be more corticobulbar, corticospinal, and rubrospinal. So this is what we've already talked about correctly, where I feel terrible that I said tectospinal when I meant reticulo. But you'll never get that wrong because I've now said it on the video 5 times. Sorry. Now we've got a whole other issue. So far we've really talked about still just these upper motor neurons working on lower motor neurons, whether or not it's ventral medial or dorsal lateral. So up till now, we've talked about upper motor neuron lesions and what happens with them and lower motor neuron, and you've got them down pat. Have you ever seen somebody with a motor deficit that doesn't look like either of these? Ever heard of somebody that might have a motor deficit that doesn't look like either of these? Where it's just not paralysis, where it's just not changes in muscle tone? Like
Nice.
who? What other systems affect the motor? We've even talked about some of them. We've seen videos of some of them. Anything that's just not simply paralysis.
Basal ganglia?
Basal ganglia, like what would you maybe see?
Uh,
Something different.
Wouldn't you see like flailing movements?
You might see some flailing movements, some involuntary movement. We haven't gotten to that one, but yes, that's a good one. We did see a basal ganglia lesion so far in the brainstem, where they kind of are stooped over. Parkinson's. Is this guy paralyzed? Does he have hyperreflexia? No. So you can have, so these are what we call these overall are pyramidal lesions, pyramidal signs. Because another name for the corticospinal tract is the pyramidal tract. So this is what we've been talking about so far, but we're going to talk about the other areas. So again, we've got our three areas, our three types of movement. I've talked about this, but now it got a little more complicated. Because we've got the cortex, we got some brainstem, going to the spinal cord. But now we've got this basal ganglia somehow doing something, right? And hello, you didn't mention the cerebellum. What happens when the cerebellum's involved? Are there some motor issues?
Yeah.
Are they paralyzed and spastic?
No.
No, what do they have?
Dysmetria.
Dysmetria,
Yeah. Everything with this.
whatever, dysarthria, ataxia, but a different presentation. And that's, so this part that we talked about with our hyperreflexia, spasticity, lack of voluntary movement is our pyramidal system. And then these are considered extrapyramidal. So an extrapyramidal lesion is a whole different class of motor deficits. So we'll start with the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia, the true basal ganglia are the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus. This is just a coronal section. Again, we've got our putamen, our globus pallidus, and here's our caudate. And remember, the internal capsule really just kind of traverses through the basal ganglia. So when you actually look at the basal ganglia, there's actually much more than just those three. Input is caudate and putamen. We've also got the substantia nigra, which has intimate connections. That's in the brainstem. What level of the brainstem? Midbrain, right? So that's in the midbrain. We have the subthalamic nucleus, which is in the diencephalon. And then we've got our output, which is the globus pallidus. So it's not just the three main basal ganglia, but it's also the substantia nigra and the subthalamic nucleus. So all of these regions will lead to extrapyramidal signs, which basically means motor deficits that are different than our classic upper motor neuron and lower motor neuron lesions. So what does the basal ganglia do? It's going to be